March 1943, U-boat Pen, Lorient, France. The concrete bunker swallows sound. 3 stories of reinforced Krupp steel and poured concrete, walls 4 meters thick, designed to withstand direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. Inside, the water is black and still. U-boats float like sleeping animals, attended by crews in grease-stained coveralls who move with the efficiency of surgeons. The air smells of salt water and welding flux. In the administrative offices above the pen, a filing cabinet contains a folder labeled Sondertransport, Nachbesprechung und Vorfall, Special Transport, Debriefings and Incidents. The folder is thin, 23 pages, 7 documented missions. The reports are typed on onion-skin paper, single-spaced, clinical in tone. They do not use words like trauma or breakdown. They use words like incident, adjustment difficulty, and operational compromise. The language is bureaucratic, sterile, designed to obscure the human dimension. But if you read carefully between the passive constructions and the euphemistic phrasing, a pattern emerges. Incident Report, U-181, February 1943. Mission Transport of Agent Margaret, real name redacted from Lorient to landing point north of Bergen. Duration, 14 days. Complications, agent experienced severe disorientation on day 7. Reported auditory hallucinations, voices speaking in English, which she claimed were coming from outside the hull. Medical officer assessed as acute stress reaction. Agent sedated. Mission completed without further incident. Agent's post-landing evaluation pending. The evaluation was never filed. Margaret disappeared 3 weeks after insertion. Norwegian resistance records, cross-referenced decades later, suggest she walked into a Gestapo office in Bergen and surrendered voluntarily. She was interrogated, then transferred to Ravensbrück. She did not survive the war. Incident Report, U-126, November 1942. Mission Transport of Agent Christina from Kiel to Swedish waters. Duration, 16 days. Complications, agent made repeated requests to abort mission. Expressed belief that boat was sinking. Commander assessed request as irrational, no structural compromise detected. Agent became physically aggressive on day 12, attempting to access the conning tower during submerged operations. Restrained by crew, sedated, delivered to landing point as planned. Agent's mental state upon transfer noted as unstable but functional. Christina completed her mission. She transmitted intelligence from Stockholm for 7 months. Then her reports stopped. Swedish police found her body in an apartment in Gamla stan in June 1943. The death was ruled a suicide. The Abwehr closed her file without comment. Incident Report, U-193, April 1943. Mission transport of 2 agents, Sonia and Erica, from Trondheim to a coastal insertion point in Scotland. Duration, estimated 19 days. Complications, mission terminated on day 11. U-193 engaged by British destroyer HMS Hesperus. Depth charge attack. Boat sustained critical damage. Emergency surface. Crew abandoned ship. All hands lost, including both agents. The Royal Navy recovered no bodies. U-193 sank in water too deep for salvage. Sonia and Erica exist now only as names in a logbook. 2 women who drowned in darkness, locked inside a steel tube filling with freezing seawater. Their mission unfinished, their deaths unrecorded, except as a line item in a folder that would remain classified for 50 years. The reports do not explain why the women broke. They document that they did, with the detached precision of engineers recording equipment failure, but the crews understood. The men who served aboard those boats, who lived in the same suffocating intimacy, who watched the women deteriorate day by day, they knew. Dieter Mannheim wrote about it in his journal, months after Clara Hoffmann left U-517. He was trying to articulate something he had observed but could not fully explain. The men adapt because they must, because they are part of the machine. They have tasks, roles, a place in the operational structure. The women have nothing. They are passengers in a vehicle they do not understand, moving toward a destination they cannot see, with no control over the journey. They are awake for the entire nightmare. And nightmares, when you cannot wake from them, become indistinguishable from reality. Psychology of submersion is well documented now. modern navies screen submariners rigorously for claustrophobia, anxiety disorders, and depressive tendencies. They provide psychiatric support, recreational facilities, even simulated daylight in newer boats. But in 1943, the Kriegsmarine had no such infrastructure. Submarine duty was voluntary, and the volunteers were selected for aggression, endurance, and indifference to discomfort. They were warriors. The women were not. They were intelligence assets, trained in tradecraft and languages, inserted into an environment that punished softness, rewarded silence, and offered no mercy to those who could not suppress their fear. The fear was not irrational. U-boats were death traps. By mid-1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare had evolved into a lethally effective science. Sonar, radar, aircraft patrols, convoy escorts equipped with depth charges and hedgehog mortars, the North Atlantic had become a killing field. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew was measured in patrols. 60% of U-boat personnel who served in the war died. 30,000 men, drowned or blown apart or crushed by pressure at depths the human body was never meant to endure. The women knew this. They were briefed minimally on survival odds, but knowledge is abstract until it becomes experience. The first depth charge attack transforms the abstract into visceral, inescapable truth. April 1943, U-517, North Atlantic. Clara Hoffman is on day 16. The boat is running submerged, 80 meters down, creeping at 4 knots to conserve battery. The hydrophone operator detects propeller noise. Destroyer, possibly 2, bearing northeast. The commander orders silent running. All non-essential systems shut down. The crew stops moving, stops talking. The boat becomes a held breath, drifting in the dark. Clara sits in the forward torpedo room, wedged between 2 torpedoes, hands pressed flat against the deck plates. She can feel the vibration through the steel, faint, rhythmic, growing louder. The destroyers are closing. Then the first charge detonates. The sound is not loud. It is beyond loud. It is a physical force, a shockwave that punches through water and steel and bone. The lights flicker. The hull groans, a deep metallic scream that sounds like the boat is tearing itself apart. Dust rains down from the overhead pipes. A valve ruptures somewhere aft, releasing a jet of steam. Men are shouting, but Clara cannot hear them. Her ears are ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowns out everything else. Another explosion, closer. The boat lurches sideways. Clara is thrown against the torpedo rack. Her shoulder hits brass hard and something cracks. Pain floods her arm, but she does not scream. She has learned not to scream. Screaming wastes air. The crew needs the air. Mannheim, braced against the navigation table, watches her through the open hatch. She is staring at the overhead, eyes wide, pupils dilated. Her mouth is moving, but no sound comes out. He realizes she is counting, over and over, the same numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, a loop mechanical, as if counting might impose order on the chaos. The attack lasts 14 minutes. 18 depth charges, none close enough to kill, but all close enough to remind everyone aboard that death is patient, methodical, and will return as many times as necessary until it succeeds. When the destroyers finally move off, the commander orders damage reports. Hydraulic leak in the stern, cracked gauge in the control room, minor flooding in the bilge, manageable, the boat will survive. Clara Hoffman does not move. She sits against the torpedo rack, cradling her injured shoulder, still counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mannheim approaches her carefully. He has seen this before, not in women, but in young sailors on their first patrol. The 1,000-yard stare, the repetitive behavior, the mind protecting itself by retreating into pattern, into ritual, into anything that is not the present moment. He kneels beside her, speaks her name. She does not respond. He touches her arm gently. She flinches, then looks at him, and for a moment her eyes are empty, not frightened, not sad, just empty, as if the person who lived behind them has evacuated and left the body running on autopilot. Hoffman, he says quietly, it's over, they're gone. She blinks, once, twice. The emptiness recedes slowly, replaced by something worse, awareness. She begins to shake, not crying, just shaking, full-body tremors, as if her nervous system has finally registered what it survived and is trying to expel the trauma through movement. Mannheim does not know what to do. He is a navigator, not a medic, not a therapist. He does the only thing he can. He sits beside her in the cold, in the stink of diesel and fear, and he waits until the shaking stops. It takes 40 minutes. She never speaks of it, not to him, not to anyone. When the boat surfaces that night, she climbs to the conning tower and stands in the wind, breathing air that does not taste like metal. Mannheim watches her from below. She is gripping the rail so tightly her knuckles are white. She does not let go for 20 minutes. June 1943, Abwehr Headquarters, Berlin. The office of Oberst Friedrich Böhm overlooks Tirpitzufer, the tree-lined avenue along the Landwehr Canal where the Abwehr conducts its bureaucratic rituals. Böhm is 47 years old, a career intelligence officer who joined the organization when it was still called the Nachrichtendienst under the Weimar Republic. He has survived 3 regime changes by perfecting the art of appearing useful without becoming indispensable. His desk is oak, polished to a mirror shine. On it sits a single folder, Sondertransport, Auswertung und Empfehlungen, evaluation and recommendations. Böhm has been tasked with determining whether the U-boat insertion program should continue. The results, after 9 months of operations, are statistically ambiguous. 12 missions completed, 8 agents successfully delivered, 4 operational failures, 2 due to enemy action, 2 due to what the reports delicately term psychological unsuitability discovered in transit. The intelligence yield has been modest. Some useful reports on Swedish shipping routes. A few low-level contacts established in Norway. Nothing that could not have been achieved, eventually, through other means. But statistics do not capture the second-order effects, the effects the folder does not quantify. Böhm opens the file and reads the confidential addendum submitted by Fregattenkapitän Hans Weber, Dönitz's liaison to Abwehr operations. Weber's assessment is blunt, written in the clipped prose of a man who has spent too many years translating operational reality into language that will not offend his superiors. Crew morale impact, significant and negative. Commanders report increased tension, declining discipline, and in 2 cases, open insubordination related to Sondertransport duties. The presence of female passengers disrupts established shipboard hierarchy. Men volunteer for extra watches to avoid compartments where the passengers are quartered. Others become protective, leading to friction with officers. One incident involved a physical altercation between crew members over alleged disrespectful comments. The commander was forced to confine both men to quarters for the remainder of the patrol. Operational security concerns, moderate. Female passengers, lacking naval training, do not understand the necessity of silence during enemy contact. In 3 documented cases, passengers made noise, crying, hyperventilating, moving carelessly during silent running conditions. While no boats were lost as a direct result, commanders assess this as an unacceptable risk. A single ill-timed sound can betray a submerged boat to sonar operators. Medical considerations, severe. Submarine medical officers are not trained in psychiatric care. Sedatives are effective in managing acute distress but cannot be administered continuously without risking the passenger's operational capability post-insertion. 2 passengers required physical restraint. One suffered a dislocated shoulder during a depth charge attack and could not receive adequate treatment aboard. Long-term psychological impact on passengers is unknown but presumed substantial. Weber's recommendation is unambiguous. Discontinue Sondertransport operations. Risk-to-benefit ratio unfavorable. Recommend alternative insertion methods be prioritized. Böhm closes the file. He does not forward Weber's recommendation. Instead, he writes his own assessment, softer in tone, emphasizing the intelligence successes while acknowledging challenges requiring procedural refinement. He recommends continuation with modifications, shorter transit times, better passenger screening, assignment of a dedicated crew member to monitor passenger welfare. He does not mention the dislocated shoulder. He does not mention the woman who tried to claw her way through a sealed hatch during a dive. He does not mention that 2 of the successfully inserted agents are now dead, one by suicide, one under circumstances the Gestapo has classified as operational security incident. He files the report and moves on to the next folder. This is how institutions preserve themselves, not through bold decisions, but through incremental compromises that allow everyone to claim they acted reasonably given the information available at the time. The program continues, but quietly with less frequency, the missions grow more selective. Commanders begin refusing assignments, citing operational constraints. Dönitz, never enthusiastic, issues a directive limiting Sondertransport to critical insertions only, subject to fleet command approval. The definition of critical is left deliberately vague. In practice, it means the missions slow to a trickle. November 1943, Kriegsmarine Medical Facility, Kiel. Ingrid Steiner sits in a windowless examination room. She returned from Oslo 3 weeks ago, exfiltrated by fishing boat after her cover was compromised. The Abuya debriefing took 6 hours. They wanted to know about her contacts, her intelligence product, the security breach that forced her extraction. They did not ask about the crossing. They did not ask about the nightmares, or why her hands shake when she holds a pen, or why she can no longer tolerate enclosed spaces. The naval doctor is young, perhaps 30, with wire-rimmed glasses and the soft hands of someone who has never held a rifle. He reads her file without looking at her. You spent 17 days aboard U-177. Yes. Any physical injuries during transit? No. Illness, infection? No. He makes a note. The report indicates you required sedation. Ingrid does not respond immediately. She is deciding how much to say. The doctor is writing in her file. Everything she says will be recorded, evaluated, used to determine her fitness for future operations. If she admits too much, they will deem her compromised, unreliable. If she admits nothing, they will send her back. I had difficulty sleeping, she says finally. The sedative helped. The doctor nods as if this is perfectly normal. Any lingering effects, anxiety, intrusive thoughts. She wants to tell him about the dreams, how she wakes gasping, convinced she is drowning, that the walls of her apartment are pressing inward like a collapsing hull, how she cannot ride the U-Bahn anymore because the tunnel darkness triggers something primal and uncontrollable, how she stood in her kitchen last week and realized she had been staring at the sink for 20 minutes, watching water run, unable to remember what she had intended to do. No, she says, I'm fine. He closes the file. Good, you're cleared for duty. Report to Section IV for reassignment. She does not report. She leaves the building, walks to the train station, and buys a ticket to Munich. She has a cousin there, someone outside the intelligence apparatus, someone who will not ask questions. She will stay with the cousin for 3 months, working in a factory that produces radio components, living under a false name until the Gestapo traces her absence and arrests her for desertion. She will be executed in February 1944, not for espionage, not for betrayal, but for the unforgivable sin of walking away. The system does not forgive those who refuse to continue. January 1944, off the coast of Scotland. U-boats are dying faster than the shipyards can replace them. The Allies have cracked the Enigma codes. Convoys are protected by aircraft carriers, destroyers equipped with advanced sonar, long-range patrol bombers that can detect a surfaced U-boat from 20 kilometers away. The North Atlantic has become a graveyard. Dönitz orders his boats to withdraw to safer hunting grounds, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, anywhere the Allied net is less dense. But the orders come too late for many. In the first 6 months of 1944, the Kriegsmarine loses 96 U-boats, nearly 4,000 men. Sondertransport missions effectively cease. The last documented case involves U-965 transporting a female operative identified only as Helena from Norway to neutral Ireland. The boat is sunk by RAF Coastal Command on March 30, 1944. No survivors. Helena's real name was Elsa Brandt. She was 24 years old, a linguist, fluent in Irish, Gaelic, and English. Her mission was to establish contact with IRA elements sympathetic to German interests. She spent 11 days aboard U-965 before it was bracketed by depth charges and destroyed in less than 3 minutes. The Abuela file on Elsa Brandt contains a single photograph, standard issue black and white, taken during initial vetting. She is looking directly at the camera, expression neutral, hair pulled back in a regulation style. Her eyes are clear, intelligent, alive. The photo is stapled to a form listing her qualifications, her training scores, her security clearance level. At the bottom, stamped in red ink, Einsatz beendet. Operation concluded. She drowned in darkness, trapped in a steel coffin at the bottom of the ocean, her body never recovered, her sacrifice noted in a ledger and then forgotten. The Third Reich did not build memorials for its spies. It did not acknowledge their existence. They were tools, deployed and discarded, their suffering invisible, their deaths administratively convenient. Dieter Mannheim survived the war. He was captured by British forces in May 1945 and spent 2 years in a POW camp in Scotland before being repatriated to Germany. He worked as a merchant marine navigator until his retirement in 1971. He did not speak publicly about his wartime service, but in 1998, after his death, his daughter found the journal in a locked desk drawer. She donated it to the German Naval Archives in Freiburg, where it was catalogued and eventually digitized. On the last page, written in August 1945, weeks after his surrender, Mannheim recorded a final entry. It is not a tactical observation. It is a confession. I have tried to forget her face, Hoffman, and the others. I tell myself they were soldiers like us, that they understood the risks. But I know this is a lie. They were not soldiers. They were civilians thrown into a machine they did not understand, expected to endure what hardened sailors could barely survive. We did this to them, not the Allies, not the war, us. We put them in those compartments and watched them break. Indeed, we told ourselves it was necessary. Perhaps it was. Perhaps history will judge the necessity. But necessity does not erase the cruelty. I see Hoffman's face sometimes in the dark when I close my eyes. She is counting, ein, zwei, drei, vier, over and over. She will count forever, and I will hear it. April 1945. Ravensbrück concentration camp, northern Germany. Camp is a study in methodical cruelty, wooden barracks arranged in precise rows, guard towers at geometric intervals, administrative complex where records are kept with obsessive bureaucratic care. In Block 11, reserved for political prisoners and those awaiting transfer or execution, a woman sits on a wooden pallet that serves as a bed. Her name is Anna Richter. She is 28 years old. She has been at Ravensbrück for 9 months. Before that, she was an Abuela operative. Before that, she spent 18 days aboard U-201. Anna does not speak of the submarine, not to the other prisoners, not to the guards, not even to herself. In the silent conversations the mind conducts when there is nothing left but memory. But the submarine is always there, beneath the surface of her thoughts, a baseline hum of dread that colors everything else. The camp is horrific. The hunger, the cold, the casual violence, the smell of the crematorium on certain days when the wind shifts south. But the camp has space. You can see the sky. You can walk, however briefly, between buildings. You are not sealed inside a tube with no horizon, no escape, no future, except the one dictated by currents and enemy patrols. Anna survived her mission. She was inserted into Denmark in February 1943, made contact with German expatriates in Copenhagen, transmitted reports for 11 months. Then the network collapsed. Someone talked, or someone was careless, and the Gestapo swept through the cell like a scythe through wheat. Anna was arrested in January 1944, not by Danish police, not by the Abuela, who might have protected her. By the Gestapo, who did not differentiate between foreign agents and domestic traitors once the operational chain broke. She was interrogated for 6 weeks. They wanted names, addresses, transmission schedules. She gave them nothing, not out of loyalty. The Reich had discarded her the moment she became inconvenient, but out of spite. If they were going to kill her, she would at least deny them the satisfaction of useful intelligence. They stopped questioning in March and transferred her to Ravensbrück. The Gestapo file classified her as politisch Häftling, political prisoner, expendable, awaiting final disposition. Final disposition never came. By April 1945, the camp administration is in chaos. Soviet forces are advancing from the east, the Americans from the west. SS officers are burning records, evacuating prisoners on death marches, trying to erase evidence of what happened in places like this. Anna is not evacuated. She is simply forgotten, one name among thousands in a disintegrating bureaucracy that has run out of time and interest. He will survive. Soviet troops will liberate the camp on April 30, 1945. Anna will walk out through gates that stand open for the first time in years, into a world that has been bombed into rubble and silence. She will make her way south, avoiding checkpoints, sleeping in destroyed buildings, eating whatever she can forage. She will reach Bavaria in June and disappear into the anonymous mass of displaced persons flooding through occupied Germany. She will never speak of her service. Never file for recognition or compensation. Never contact the fragmentary remains of the Obuea, disbanded and hunted by Allied intelligence. In 1952, a researcher attempting to document Obuea operations will find her name in a partially destroyed file recovered from a bombed-out archive in Berlin. He will track her to a small town outside Stuttgart where she works as a seamstress. He will write her a letter requesting an interview. She will not respond. He will visit in person. She will close the door in his face. He will conclude in his notes that she is uncooperative, possibly traumatized, unwilling to discuss wartime activities. He is correct on all counts. Anna Richter has spent 7 years rebuilding a life that does not include the past. She will not dismantle that work for the sake of historical curiosity. August 1973, Hamburg, West Germany. Dieter Mannheim is 71 years old. He is dying, lung cancer, metastatic, inoperable. He has perhaps 3 months. He is sitting in the living room of his daughter's apartment, looking out over the Elbe River, where container ships move in slow, stately procession toward the port. His daughter, Greta, is in the kitchen making tea. She does not know about the journal. She does not know her father kept a record of those years, or that the record contains details he has never spoken aloud. Mannheim is thinking about Clara Hoffmann. He has thought about her intermittently for 30 years, always with a low-grade guilt that never quite resolves into action. He does not know what happened to her, whether she completed her mission, whether she survived the war, whether she is alive now, somewhere, living under a different name, trying to forget what it felt like to sit in a torpedo room, counting to 4 over and over while the world exploded around her. He decides, in a moment of clarity unusual for a man on morphine, that someone should know, not the sanitized version, not the operational reports with their sterile language and omitted details, the truth, what it was actually like, what they did to those women. He calls Greta into the room. "There is something in my desk," he says, "a notebook. After I'm gone, I want you to donate it to the Naval Archives or a museum. Somewhere it will be preserved." Greta agrees, not understanding the significance, assuming it is old navigation logs or technical notes. She does not read it, not then, not until years later after his death, when she is sorting through his belongings and finds the journal wrapped in oilcloth at the back of a locked drawer. She reads it in one sitting, appalled and fascinated, unable to reconcile the precise, compassionate voice in the entries with the quiet, reserved man who was her father. She donates it as he requested. The archives accept it, catalog it, and file it away. It sits untouched for 17 years until a graduate student researching U-boat logistics stumbles across it while cross-referencing crew manifests. The student, a woman named Petra Skoll, recognizes immediately that she has found something extraordinary. She writes her dissertation on Sondertransport operations, using Mannheim's journal as a primary source. The dissertation is published in 1997. It receives modest attention, a few reviews in academic journals, a brief mention in a documentary about Obuea operations. But it reaches someone, a woman in Oslo, 82 years old, living alone in a care facility near the harbor. Her name is Clara Hoffmann. She changed it after the war, married, divorced, reverted to her maiden name decades later when her husband died. She has told no one about her service, not her children, not her grandchildren. She buried it so deeply that some days she almost believes it did not happen. Then she sees the dissertation mentioned in a newspaper article about wartime espionage. The article includes a photograph of Mannheim, taken in 1943. Clara recognizes him instantly, the navigator, the one who sat with her after the depth charge attack, who did not speak, who simply waited until the shaking stopped. She obtains a copy of the dissertation, reads it slowly over several days in the privacy of her small room overlooking the fjord. She does not cry, she is beyond tears, but something inside her, something that has been locked and frozen for 50 years, shifts slightly, cracks. She is not angry that Mannheim wrote about her. She is grateful, grateful that someone remembered, that someone bore witness, that the silence has finally been broken. She writes a letter to Petra Skoll. It is brief, handwritten, the script shaky but legible. I am the woman from U517. I read your work. Thank you for telling the truth. I have carried this alone for too long. Now perhaps I can set it down. Skoll receives the letter 3 weeks later. She is stunned. She responds immediately, asking if Clara would be willing to speak on record. Clara agrees. They meet in Oslo in a cafe near the harbor, and Clara tells her story, all of it. The cold, the smell, the counting, the depth charges. The way the crew stopped seeing her after the first week, as if she had become invisible. The way she returned to the world feeling like something had been extracted from her, some essential capacity for normalcy, and she never got it back. Skoll records the interview. It becomes the centerpiece of her next book, published in 2001, Ghosts in the Hull, Women, Espionage, and the Kriegsmarine's Secret Transports. The book wins a regional history prize. It is translated into English and Norwegian. It brings Clara Hoffman a measure of recognition she never sought but does not refuse. She gives 2 more interviews, both restrained, factual, free of self-pity. She dies in 2003 at the age of 86. Her obituary in the Aftenposten mentions her wartime service in a single sentence. It does not mention the nightmares. It does not mention that she avoided elevators for the rest of her life, or that she could not sleep in rooms without windows, or that she once told her daughter, late at night after too much wine, that she still sometimes wakes up convinced she is underwater, that the walls are closing in, that she will never surface again. The human cost of Sondertransport was never tallied in any official document. The Abwehr did not conduct post-war assessments. The Kriegsmarine did not memorialize its auxiliary casualties. The women who survived carried the weight privately, in silence, because no one knew to ask, and because the asking would have required acknowledging that the machinery of war consumed more than just soldiers. It consumed anyone placed in its path, including those who were promised they were serving a greater purpose, that their suffering was necessary, that history would remember their sacrifice. History, for the most part, did not. Present day, German Naval Museum, Wilhelmshaven. The Type IXC U-boat replica sits in a climate-controlled hall beneath industrial lighting that tries, unsuccessfully, to soften the brutality of its design. Visitors walk through the forward torpedo room, past the conning tower, into the diesel engine compartment. Everything is clean, painted, preserved. The air smells faintly of oil and metal polish. Plaques explain the specifications. Length 76.76 meters, displacement 1,120 tons surfaced, maximum depth 230 meters, crew complement 48. The plaques do not mention the smell. They do not mention the cold, the hunger, the psychological erosion that occurred inside this machine over weeks of submersion. There is a small exhibit near the exit, added in 2004, titled Sondertransport, Frauen im Kriegunterwasser, Special Transport, Women at War Beneath the Sea. It consists of 3 display panels, 2 photographs, and a single artifact, Clara Hoffman's wool blanket, donated by her daughter after Clara's death. The blanket is folded behind glass, grey and threadbare, with a small brown stain near one corner that might be blood or rust, or simply the residue of time. The text panel summarizes the program in measured, academic language. 16 missions, 8 successful insertions, 4 fatalities, operational parameters, strategic justification. The panel does not convey what it felt like. No museum exhibit can. You cannot reconstruct the suffocating intimacy of life inside a submarine, the way fear becomes ambient, a background radiation you absorb until it changes you at the cellular level. You cannot simulate the psychological architecture of being human cargo, stripped of agency, subjected to conditions that violate every instinct for self-preservation while being told that your discomfort is operationally irrelevant. But the blanket speaks in its own silent way. It is evidence, proof that these women existed, that they were not simply administrative entries in classified files, but human beings who occupied space, who needed warmth, who bled and trembled and endured. March 2019, a nursing home outside Munich. Helga Stern is 94 years old. She is the last known survivor of the Sondertransport program. She made the crossing in December 1943 aboard U-230 from Kiel to the Swedish coast. Her mission was to establish contact with anti-Nazi German expatriates in Stockholm and facilitate the transfer of defectors willing to provide intelligence to the Allies. It was a double game. She was working secretly with British intelligence, using the Abwehr as cover. The operation was successful. She spent 18 months in Sweden before exfiltrating to England in 1945. She was debriefed by MI6, resettled under a new identity, and lived quietly in London until 1998, when she returned to Germany after her husband died. She has never spoken publicly about her service, not to journalists, not to historians, not even to her own children, who know only that their mother did something in the war but were taught not to ask. In 2019, Petra Skoll contacts her, having tracked her down through declassified MI6 files cross-referenced with Abwehr personnel records. Skoll writes a letter, careful and respectful, requesting an interview. Helga does not respond for 3 months. Then, unexpectedly, she calls. "You may visit," she says. Her voice is thin, precise, the accent still faintly British after decades in England. "But I will not be recorded, and you will not use my real name." Skoll agrees. They meet in the nursing home's garden in late afternoon sunlight that filters through birch trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. Helga sits in a wheelchair, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth. Her hands are folded in her lap, gnarled with arthritis. Her eyes are clear. "You want to know what it was like," Helga says. "It is not a question." "Yes." Helga is silent for a long time, looking past Skoll toward the trees. "It was like being buried alive," she says finally. "Except you were expected to remain calm, functional, ready to perform your mission upon arrival. They did not train us for that. They trained us to lie, to encode messages, to recognize surveillance. They did not train us to live inside a coffin for 3 weeks without losing our minds." She pauses. A nurse passes on the path, pushing another resident. Helga waits until they are out of earshot. "I survived because I dissociated," she continues. "I learned to separate myself from my body, to observe the experience as if it were happening to someone else. It is a skill, dissociation. Some people have it naturally, others develop it under extreme stress. I became very good at it, too good perhaps. After the war I had difficulty reconnecting. My husband would speak to me, and I would realize minutes had passed and I had not heard a word. I was somewhere else, still on that boat, in some corner of my mind, counting the seconds until I could surface." Skoll asks if she experienced the hallucinations, the panic attacks documented in other cases. Helga shakes her head. "Hallucinations, but the fear, yes. Constant, not sharp, not dramatic, just a low hum of terror that never stopped. You learn to function with it. You learn to eat, sleep, breathe while terrified. It becomes your baseline. And when you return to the world, normal fear feels trivial. My children would worry about exams, relationships, career setbacks. I could not relate. I had been to a place where fear meant death, where a single sound at the wrong moment could condemn 48 men to drowning. Everything else seemed small." She looks at Skoll directly. "That is the cost they do not mention, not just the missions that failed, not just the women who died, but the ones who survived and spent the rest of their lives unable to fully return. We were ghosts. We moved through the world, we raised families, we worked and smiled and pretended, but part of us never left that hull. Part of us is still there, in the dark, waiting to surface." The moral calculus. The Sondertransport program was, by the standards of its time, a rational operational decision. The Abwehr needed to insert agents into occupied and neutral territories. U-boats provided a stealthy, relatively secure transport method. The fact that the conditions were psychologically destructive was not, from a bureaucratic perspective, disqualifying. The Reich's calculus was simple. If the agent could be delivered and perform the mission, the cost to her mental health was acceptable. If she could not, she was replaced. This is not unique to Nazi Germany. All wartime intelligence services operate on versions of this logic. Agents are assets. Assets are expendable. The mission supersedes the individual. The British, the Soviets, the Americans all deployed operatives under conditions that caused lasting psychological harm. The difference, perhaps, is one of degree and documentation. The Western Allies, at least in later years, acknowledged the human cost. They provided pensions, medical care, recognition. The Third Reich provided nothing. The women who served were erased, their contributions unrecorded, their suffering invisible. But erasure is not the same as non-existence. The women existed, they suffered, and their suffering reveals something fundamental about the machinery of war. It does not discriminate between soldiers and civilians, between combatants and auxiliaries. It consumes everyone it touches. The only variable is the efficiency of the consumption. The U-boats were supremely efficient machines. They killed enemy sailors by the thousands. They sank millions of tons of shipping. And incidentally, they destroyed the minds of a handful of women whose names appear in no memorial, whose sacrifices earn no medals, whose grave, if they have grave, bear no indication of what they endured in service to a regime that valued them only as instruments. A final record. In 2021, the German Naval Archives completed a digitization project, making wartime documents available to researchers worldwide. Among the newly accessible files was a folder from the Abwehr archive labeled Sondertransport, Abschlussbericht, Final Report. It had been misfiled, buried in a box of logistics documents, overlooked for 76 years. The report, dated May 1945, was never completed. The author, an Abwehr officer named Otto Reinhardt, began compiling operational data in April 1945 as the Reich collapsed around him. He documented 16 missions, listed the agents' code names, summarized outcomes. He included a section titled Nachträgliche Bewertung, Retrospective Assessment. It consists of 2 paragraphs, handwritten, added after the typed text. The Sondertransport program achieved its tactical objectives in 50% of cases, which compares favorably to alternative insertion methods. However, the human cost was severe and inadequately anticipated. The psychological strain placed on female operatives during submarine transit exceeded all projections. Training protocols failed to prepare them for the reality of extended submersion in combat conditions. Medical support was insufficient. The operational assumption that agents could endure the crossing and remain functional was only partially validated. In retrospect, the program's continuation beyond the initial trial phase was a mistake. The intelligence gained did not justify the damage inflicted on the operatives. Several did not survive their missions. Others were compromised due to psychological deterioration, that impaired their judgment and operational security. A full accounting will require access to post-mission debriefings and medical records, many of which have been lost or destroyed. This report remains incomplete. Otto Reinhardt was captured by American forces in May 1945. He was interrogated, classified as a low-level functionary, and released in 1946. He returned to civilian life, worked as an accountant, and died in 1979. He never completed the report. The full accounting he called for never occurred. But the fragments remain: Mannheim's journal, Clara's testimony, Helga's quiet confession in a garden in Munich, the blanket behind glass. These fragments form a mosaic, incomplete but undeniable, of what happened in those steel tubes beneath the Atlantic. They are evidence that bureaucratic efficiency, even in service of strategic goals, exacts costs that cannot be measured in operational success rates or intelligence yields. The cost is borne by individuals, in darkness, in silence, in the slow erosion of the self, under conditions designed to strip away everything except the capacity to endure. The women of Sondertransport endured. Some broke, some survived. All paid a price that no post-war settlement acknowledged, no reparations program addressed, no memorial commemorated. They are ghosts in the historical record, names in classified files, shadows moving through a narrative that has largely forgotten them. But they were real, they suffered. And their suffering matters, not because it was unique. War produces suffering on scales that dwarf individual stories, but because it reveals the banal, systematic cruelty embedded in institutions that view human beings as resources to be allocated and expended. The Reich did not invent this cruelty. It perfected it, systematized it, documented it with meticulous care. And then, when the documentation became inconvenient, it burned the files and pretended the cruelty had never occurred. The blanket behind glass says otherwise. So does the journal. So does Helga Stern, 94 years old, still counting the days until she surfaces from a voyage that ended 76 years ago. History does not erase these women. We do, by not asking, by not listening, by accepting the sanitized versions that omit the screaming, the counting, the empty eyes staring at steel bulkheads in the dark, by filing their stories under operational complications and moving on to the next tactical assessment. This is the final cost of Sondertransport, not just what it did to the women, but what it reveals about us, about how easily we accept that some suffering is necessary, some costs are acceptable, some voices can be silenced in service of missions we no longer remember and causes that history has judged and found monstrous. The women remember, the few who are left, and when they are gone, all that will remain are fragments, a blanket, a journal, a photograph, a brief mention in a museum exhibit, ghosts in the hull, counting, waiting to surface, knowing they never will. October 1943, North Atlantic, 320 kilometers west of the Faroe Islands. The air inside U-517 tastes like iron and diesel and something else, something organic, rotting slowly in the cold. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Condensation weeps down the steel ribs of the pressure hull in steady, patient drops. In the forward torpedo room, between the gleaming brass noses of two G7E electric torpedoes, a woman sits on a folded blanket. Her name is Clara Hoffman. She is 26 years old. She has not seen daylight in 11 days. She does not move when the diesel engines cough and rumble to life somewhere aft. She has learned not to flinch. The boat is diving again, third time since dawn. The deck tilts forward and the torpedoes creak in their cradles. Clara's hands are wrapped around a tin cup of cold ersatz coffee. She does not drink. She simply holds it, feeling the metal grow warm against her palms, as if this small exchange of heat might prove she is still alive. No one told her it would be like this. The Abuela briefing in Hamburg 4 weeks earlier had been clinical, professional. A rear admiral with a face like carved wood had explained the mission parameters. She would be inserted into occupied Norway via U-boat. From there, overland to Sweden. Intelligence work, high value, high risk. The admiral did not mention the smell. He did not mention the silence, the kind that sits on your chest like a predator. He did not mention that the crew would stop looking at her after the first 72 hours, as if she were a ghost they had all agreed not to see. The Kriegsmarine called it Sondertransport, special transport. The men who served aboard these boats had a different name, Geistfracht, ghost cargo. By the winter of 1943, Nazi Germany's intelligence apparatus had become desperate and fragmented. The Abuela, under Wilhelm Canaris, was hemorrhaging credibility. Operations were failing. Networks were collapsing. The Eastern Front was devouring entire armies, and the Reich needed eyes and ears in places where men could no longer move freely. Women young, educated, fluent in multiple languages became assets, expendable ones, and the fastest, quietest way to move them across Allied naval choke points was beneath the surface of the sea, inside the cramped, hostile darkness of a Type IXC U-boat. Clara Hoffman is one of 7 women documented to have made such crossings between 1942 and 1944. 3 survived the war. 2 spoke briefly in the 1970s. Clara never did. What we know of her comes from the logbook of Kapitän Lieutenant Dieter Mannheim, navigator aboard U-517, who kept a private journal that surfaced in a Kiel estate sale in 1998. Mannheim wrote in clipped, precise German. He recorded weather, depth, engine performance, and in margins barely legible, he recorded what it did to the women. Day 9, Hoffman refuses food, sits for hours without moving. Oberleutnant Kress says this is normal. I do not believe him. The forward torpedo room was never designed for passengers. It was a magazine, a mechanical womb built to house death in sleek, calibrated form. The Type IXC carried 22 torpedoes. 6 were loaded in tubes. The rest were stacked in racks, suspended from chains, stored beneath the deck plates. The room measured roughly 4 meters wide and 8 meters long. Into this space, the Kriegsmarine inserted a human being and expected her to remain functional for 2 to 3 weeks. There was no privacy, no partition. The crew rotated through in shifts, loading, checking seals, making adjustments. They stepped over her, around her. Sometimes, when the boat rolled in heavy seas, they braced themselves against the torpedoes inches from where she slept. At first, Clara tried to make herself small. She learned quickly that smallness did not matter. The room had no concept of modesty. The men had no time for shame. Sanitation was a lesson in humiliation. A single bucket, emptied twice daily if the boat was surfaced. If not, it waited. The smell thickened, mingling with the diesel, the sweat, the slow bacterial rot of bilge water. Mannheim wrote, Day 12. Hoffman asked permission to wash. Kress denied. Water rations already critical. She did not ask again. The psychological architecture of a U-boat is one of methodical erasure. You are stripped of horizon, of sunlight, of any reference point outside the hull. Time loses structure. The watch schedule, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, becomes the only rhythm. But Clara was not part of the watch. She existed outside the schedule, suspended in a liminal space where nothing marked the passage of hours except the slow accumulation of dread. She began to hear things. Mannheim noted it on day 14. Clara reported sounds, scratching, metallic tapping, coming from inside the torpedo tubes. The chief engineer inspected them, found nothing. Kress dismissed it as stress. Mannheim was less certain. He had seen this before once on a previous run. A different woman, a different cargo. She had lasted 9 days before she began screaming during a depth charge attack. They had sedated her with morphine, strapped her to a bunk in the aft compartment. She made the crossing, technically, but Mannheim wrote that when they surfaced off the Norwegian coast, her eyes no longer tracked movement. She stared at the ceiling, blinking in slow, mechanical intervals like a machine winding down. The Abuela never acknowledged the psychological casualties. There were no medical reports, no debriefings that mentioned acute dissociative episodes or sensory hallucinations. The women were delivered, or they were not. The state of their minds upon arrival was not a mission parameter. Clara Hoffman lasted 19 days aboard U-517. On November 2, 1943, the boat surfaced 3 kilometers off the coast of Trondheim. She was transferred to a civilian fishing vessel, then to a safe house in the hills above the city. Mannheim watched her climb the conning tower ladder. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she had forgotten how legs worked. She did not look back. He never saw her again. The Kriegsmarine conducted 63 documented Sondertransport missions between 1942 and 1944. 16 involved female operatives. Of those 16, 4 women died, 2 from illness contracted aboard, 1 from a torpedo attack that sank U-193, and 1 by her own hand 3 days after making landfall in Scotland. The operational success rate was 41%. By comparison, male agents inserted via parachute had a success rate of 38%. The U-boat method was statistically superior. It was also invisible, quiet, and it broke people in ways that could not be measured in after-action reports. What they faced in those steel coffins was not enemy fire. It was something slower, more patient, a kind of suffocation that did not kill the body but hollowed out the mind, 1 hour at a time, until what remained was a shell tea. Hat still breathed, still followed orders, but had lost the ability to remember what it felt like to be human. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm was never intended to carry passengers. When Grossadmiral Karl Dönitz assumed command of the submarine fleet in 1936, his strategic vision was singular: attack Allied merchant shipping, sever Britain's supply lines, starve the island into submission. The Type VII and Type IX boats were engineered as predators, lean, brutal, optimized for tonnage, destroyed per mission. Every cubic meter of internal space was allocated. Every kilogram accounted for. Crew comfort was not a design parameter, crew survival barely. The standard Type IX sea patrol lasted between 8 and 12 weeks. The boat carried a complement of 48 men. They shared 39 bunks. Off-duty sailors slept in rotation, a practice called hot bunking. You climbed into a rack still warm and damp from the previous occupant. The air was a chemical soup: carbon dioxide, diesel fumes, battery acid vapor, human methane. the sour-sweet stink of unwashed bodies pressed together in a tube 7 meters wide. After 2 weeks at sea, the atmosphere became so toxic that striking a match in certain compartments could trigger an explosion. Into this environment, in the autumn of 1942, the Abuela introduced a new variable, human cargo that could not be treated as cargo. The decision was not made lightly. The Abuela had exhausted conventional insertion methods. Parachute drops into occupied territories were compromised, British radar had grown too sophisticated, and the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee safe corridors. Surface vessels were hunted mercilessly by Royal Navy destroyers. Neutral Sweden, surrounded by Allied patrols, had become nearly inaccessible by air or sea, but U-boats moved through a different world. They operated in 3 dimensions, sliding beneath the surface surveillance grid, immune to radar, silent as stones. If you could endure the crossing, they were the safest passage in the European theater. The Abuela pitched the concept to Dönitz in July 1942. Dönitz refused. He argued that U-boats were combat platforms, not transport ferries. He cited space constraints, operational security, crew morale. The boats were already overcrowded. Adding non-essential personnel would degrade combat effectiveness. He had no interest in babysitting spies. The decision was overruled by Hitler personally. The Führer had become obsessed with intelligence failures in Scandinavia. Soviet partisans were operating with impunity in northern Norway. The Swedish government was providing covert aid to the Allies. Germany needed operatives in place, deep cover, long-term, capable of blending into civilian populations. Women, Hitler insisted, were less conspicuous. A young woman traveling alone might be a refugee, a displaced worker, a relative visiting family. A young man of military age would be stopped, questioned, detained. The logic was cold and arithmetically sound. Dönitz relented. Operational orders were issued in September 1942. U-boat commanders were informed via coded radio transmission, prepared to accept Sondertransport passengers. The commanders were not pleased. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Bauer, commander of U-126, wrote in a post-war interrogation, "We were told 3 days before departure. No advance preparation, no modifications to the boat, just make room. How, where? We were already stacking provisions in the heads. Now we were expected to accommodate a civilian female who had no training, no understanding of submarine operations, and whose presence would compromise every aspect of shipboard discipline." The women selected for Sondertransport were not random recruits. They were Abuela assets, vetted through a selection process that prioritized linguistic skill, psychological stability, and ideological commitment. Most were in their early 20s. Many had university education, unusual for women of that era. Some had spent time abroad, in England or America, and spoke flawless English with regional accents. A few had family connections to Nazi party elites, which provided both leverage and expendability. If they succeeded, they were heroes. If they vanished, they had never existed. The training, conducted at a facility outside Hamburg, lasted 6 weeks. It covered cipher work, dead drops, surveillance detection, cover identity maintenance. It did not cover submarine operations. The instructors assumed the boats would simply transport them, like luggage. No one explained what it meant to live inside a machine designed to kill and die beneath the ocean. No one mentioned the cold, the noise, the claustrophobia, the casual violence of a depth charge attack that could crack your teeth and rupture your eardrums even if it missed. Ingrid Steiner was 23 when she boarded U-177 in October 1942. She had studied languages at Heidelberg. She spoke French, English, Swedish, and Norwegian. Her mission, insert into O. Slow establish contact with German expatriates, report on Swedish iron ore shipments to Britain. Her file, declassified in 1987, describes her as confident, composed, physically resilient. The psychological evaluation noted, subject demonstrates high tolerance for stress and isolation. The evaluation was conducted in a quiet office with sunlight streaming through the windows. It did not test what happened when you spent 16 days in a compartment where the walls sweat oil and the air tastes like metal, and every 30 minutes, the entire structure shudders as the diesels cough to life and the world tilts 15 degrees, and you have no control, no agency, no ability to leave or scream or demand that it stop. Steiner lasted 11 days before she asked the commander to surface and let her off. Anywhere, she did not care, just off the boat. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Schulz, refused. They were in the middle of the North Atlantic. Surfacing in daylight would expose them to air patrols. She would have to wait. Steiner began to hyperventilate. Schulz ordered the boat's medic to sedate her with a mild opiate. She spent the next 6 days in a semi-conscious haze, strapped to a bunk in the officers' quarters, emerging only when they reached the Norwegian coast. Her mission was completed. She made contact, gathered intelligence, transmitted reports for 9 months before the Gestapo arrested her for reasons unrelated to her work. A clerical error flagged her identity papers as fraudulent. She was executed in April 1944. The Abuya file notes her operational success. It does not mention that she returned from the U-boat crossing 30 pounds lighter, with a tremor in her hands that never fully disappeared. The Kriegsmarine established rudimentary protocols after the first 3 missions revealed systemic problems. Female passengers were to be assigned sleeping space in the least trafficked compartment available, usually the forward torpedo room or, on some boats, a small alcove near the galley. They were issued a wool blanket, a cup, a spoon. They were permitted 1 small bag of personal items, weight not to exceed 5 kilograms. They were instructed to remain silent during attack conditions and to follow all crew orders without question. They were not to interact with the crew beyond necessity. This last rule was unenforceable. A U-boat crew, isolated for months, starved of privacy and normalcy, does not ignore the presence of a woman. Some men became protective, offering extra rations, a cleaner blanket, a few words of encouragement. Others grew resentful, viewing her as dead weight, a distraction, a violation of the boat's masculine equilibrium. A few became obsessed. Mannheim's journal references an incident aboard U-517 involving a young machinist who began leaving small gifts near Clara Hoffman's sleeping area, a piece of chocolate, a folded note, a carved wooden bird. Hoffman reported it to the executive officer. The machinist was reassigned to the engine room and forbidden from entering the forward compartment. Mannheim wrote, "Discipline holds, but only barely. The men are not accustomed to restraint in this matter. The boat is too small for secrets." The operational reality was this: you could not maintain the fiction of separation. The woman existed in the same 60-meter tube as 48 men, breathing the same foul air, hearing the same groans of the hull under pressure, smelling the same fear when the depth charges started falling. She became part of the boat's ecosystem, whether anyone wanted it or not. And ecosystems under extreme stress do not behave predictably.